Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really intense story. It's a stark look at survival, ideology, and, well, the huge challenges of a modern manhunt.
That's right.
We're diving into the sources you've shared about Eric Rudolph. Most people know him for the Centennial Olympic Park bombing and others in the mid to late 90s.
Exactly. And while those bombings are, infamous, this deep dive isn't just about what he did. We're focusing specifically on the how and the where of his 5 years on the run. He was one of the most wanted fugitives in the U.S. at the time.
Right, so we've got this collection of articles, research covering the attacks, his disappearance, the massive manhunt involving multiple agencies, his capture eventually, and then everything that came after.
hmm
Our mission here is to really unpack these sources. We want to understand the tactics he used to stay hidden for, well, half a decade, and the specific environmental, even social factors that helped him.
And the flip side, too, the incredible challenges law enforcement faced. What this whole saga tells us about domestic threats and, chasing down fugitives.
It's a deep dive into a pretty unique slice of American history. You've got wilderness survival mixed with like urban scavenging, all while testing the limits of law enforcement in this really complex setting.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
Okay, let's jump into the timeline the sources lay out. It kicks off with just a horrific series of events. The bombing at Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, that was July 1996.
Right.
Then attacks on an abortion clinic in Sandy Springs, January 97, a lesbian bar, the Other Side Lounge, February 97, and then another clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, January 1998.
These weren't just about damaging buildings. People died. People were severely injured. Alice Hawthorne was killed at the Olympic Park, and a Turkish cameraman, too, caught in the second blast's aftermath.
Yeah.
Then in Birmingham, police officer Robert Sanderson was killed, and nurse Emily Lyons suffered critical, life-altering injuries.
Just devastating. So the sources point to that Birmingham bombing as the real turning point for the investigation the moment it zeroed in on Rudolph.
Yeah.
How did they make that connection?
Well, it's February 14th, 1998. Witnesses saw a white pickup truck leaving the scene. Crucially, they got a partial license plate number.
Ah, the plate.
That detail was gold. It led investigators pretty quickly to Eric Rudolph.
So she must have known they were closing in fast. What did the sources say about his immediate reaction?
He knew his identity was likely out there. Capture felt imminent, so he fled immediately, headed straight for the mountains in western North Carolina, rugged terrain, but familiar to him.
And just like that, he essentially vanished, became a ghost.
Pretty much. By May 5th, 1998, the FBI officially placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list.
Right.
And that action triggered this massive federal manhunt, one of the biggest, most expensive in U.S. history up to that point. He stayed gone for 5 years.
5 years. This is where the story gets, well, kind of mind-boggling. How on earth does someone with seemingly every federal agency looking for them survive in the wilderness for that long? The sources suggest it wasn't just luck or reactive hiding.
Oh, not at all. His survival was this complex mix. Skills, planning, adaptability. He spent most of those 5 years hiding out in the Nantahala National Forest, mainly in Cherokee and Graham counties in North Carolina.
Terrain he knew well, right, from growing up there.
Intimately. He knew the land.
I remember reading in the sources about his use of lines of drift. What exactly does that mean in terms of evading a manhunt like this?
It's a survivalist tactic, really. Instead of using marked trails or obvious paths, which search teams would focus on, he'd move along less predictable routes. Think ridge lines, creek beds, just cutting through dense woods where people wouldn't normally go.
Making himself harder to track.
Deliberately.
Yeah.
Making systematic sweeps incredibly difficult for the search teams.
And the sources really stress this wasn't just him running into the woods blindly. He'd actually prepared for this.
Absolutely. It seems very premeditated. The sources indicate he had already scouted out potential hiding spots, caves, unoccupied cabins, well before he even became a fugitive. It suggests he'd contemplated this possibility, this kind of fugitive existence. There's also mention his mother had survivalist beliefs, which might have, influenced his own preparedness.
Okay, so knowing the land, having spots picked out, that's one piece. But the day-to-day survival, how did he actually sustain himself? Food, supplies.
Well, he was clearly a skilled outdoorsman. He could hunt. He knew how to move without leaving much trace, how to avoid tracking dogs. But the sources show it wasn't just traditional wilderness survival. It was this hybrid approach.
Like the foraging. I read about acorns and salamanders.
Yeah, that was part of it, definitely. Basic foraging. But he also relied pretty heavily on stealing and scavenging.
Healing?
Yep. vegetables from people's gardens, grain from silos.
And the scavenging part sounds almost strategic. The sources paint quite a picture.
It was remarkably systematic, not just random dumpster diving. He'd watch grocery stores, restaurants, figured out their routines, especially waste disposal.
When they'd put the trash out.
Exactly. He'd wait until late at night, often after closing, then raid the dumpsters. He knew when and where to look for discarded food. It's almost like intelligence gathering, but applied to finding trash.
That takes a different kind of planning than just knowing how to navigate the woods.
It really shows his adaptability, his determination, and the sources also mention how he managed his appearance for those times he got closer to towns. He mostly traveled at night, obviously.
Right.
But he kept himself clean-shaven, trimmed his mustache, apparently dyed his hair black, wore clean clothes, even new sneakers sometimes, trying to blend in if he had to.
And he had hidden supplies stashed away, too.
Yes, supply caches. Mentioned burying 55-gallon barrels in the woods, filled with things like grain, soy, oats. That's long-term planning right there.
So you combine the deep woods skills, the opportunistic scavenging, the meticulous planning. That's a tough combination to beat if you're trying to find someone.
Made him exceptionally hard to track down. And while the sources do say he went through periods of sickness, maybe malnourishment early on, by the time he was caught, he was described as being in a very good shape. Thinner, but fit.
Okay, let's flip to the other side then. The manhunt itself, the scale sounds just enormous.
Oh, it was huge.
Yeah.
One of the most extensive, resource-intensive manhunts in U.S. history. Cost something like $24 million. Big reward out for him, FBI 10 Most Wanted list.
And this involved that multi-agency task force, right? The Southeast Bomb Task Force.
Correct. You had ATF, FBI, state police, local law enforcement all working together. But interestingly, one of the early big challenges wasn't just finding him. It was convincing everyone involved that he was still even in the area.
Really? The sources mentioned skepticism from the public, maybe even some officials.
Yeah, there was definitely doubt about whether he was still alive or if he'd somehow slipped out of the region entirely. That was a real hurdle.
So what kept the core investigators focused on Western NC?
Well, key people in the task force, especially those with deep local knowledge and an understanding of Rudolph's background and personality, they were apparently absolutely adamant he was still hiding out there in the mountains. They trusted their instincts and local intelligence.
Okay, beyond that internal debate, what were the big external roadblocks for the manhunt?
Well, first, the terrain itself. Those Appalachian mountains are incredibly rugged, dense, a huge natural advantage for him.
Right.
Then, early on, you had the intense media frenzy and the whole tragic Richard Jewell situation, the initial false accusation in the Atlanta bombing. That diverted a lot of resources and attention initially.
Yeah, that complicated things immensely.
Plus, Rudolph was described as a loner. That makes traditional intelligence gathering, finding informants, tracking known associates really, really difficult. He didn't seem to have a network.
And then there's this other layer the sources bring up, the local sentiment. Resistance, maybe even sympathy from some residents.
Yeah, this was a persistent, tricky factor. The sources are clear. Some folks in the area either sympathized with Rudolph's anti-government views, maybe believed he was innocent, or even saw him as some kind of Aryan hero.
I read about those Run, Rudolph, Run t-shirts, even country songs about him.
Exactly. Those things illustrate the kind of challenging environment law enforcement was operating in. Now, the FBI stated they didn't find evidence of, like, an organized underground railroad helping him.
But the sympathy was enough to be an obstacle.
For sure. That general sentiment, that distrust of federal authorities in some pockets, it definitely made it harder for the task force to gather tips and operate smoothly.
So 5 years of this, facing the terrain, the media glare, this complex local dynamic. How did the manhunt itself change or evolve?
Well, the Rudolph case actually became a major learning experience, according to the sources. It starkly highlighted the need for much better coordination and information sharing between federal, state, and local agencies.
Interagency cooperation.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that push apparently intensified significantly in earnest after the attacks on September 11, 2001. The Rudolph manhunt became kind of a case study for improving domestic counterterrorism efforts. It showed threats could come from within, requiring really tight federal-local partnerships.
That's a really significant, maybe unexpected outcome of this whole thing. And the sources also make a powerful point that the constant pressure of the manhunt served another purpose beyond just trying to catch him.
Yes, it effectively functioned as a proactive counterterrorism measure.
Preventing more attacks.
That's what FBI Executive Chris Swecker argued. He's quoted saying the relentless pursuit absolutely kept Rudolph from carrying out more bombings, and Rudolph himself later admitted it. He said he had at least 4 caches of explosives hidden out there.
4 caches?
Yeah, including one apparently hidden quite close to the Manhunt's command post armory, chillingly enough.
Yeah.
He even admitted he'd toyed with going after the agents hunting him. So that constant pressure, keeping him focused on survival and evasion, it neutralized his ability to actually use those explosives or plan new attacks.
That's incredible. The simple fact they were looking for him was actively stopping future violence.
Underscores the value of just persistence in these long-term pursuits. The sources also hint at a psychological game. Rudolph apparently had some access to news, smuggled radios maybe, so he knew they were out there.
He knew the hunt was on.
Right. And there's even a suggestion, maybe speculative, that letting local police make the initial contact at the time of capture was a tactical move, playing on his known anti-government bias, perhaps hoping local officers might lead to a less volatile encounter than federal agents swooping in.
Interesting angle. So while he acted alone, the lone wolf idea in the bombings and the evasion, the sources connect his motivations to wider currents.
They do. They emphasize he wasn't just acting totally in a vacuum. He was, as one source put it, produced by a movement and encouraged by a culture.
Meaning his ideology wasn't unique to him.
Exactly. His stated motives, anti-abortion, anti-gay, stemmed from specific, deeply distorted beliefs that unfortunately resonate within certain extremist circles. Even if he didn't have active accomplices, his actions aligned with, and were maybe fueled by, that broader culture.
Which brings us, finally, to the end of the chase. May 31st, 2003. How did they finally catch Eric Rudolph?
It happened in Murphy, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Which is very close to where he originally vanished 5 years earlier.
And the actual moment of capture, it feels almost ordinary compared to the epic 5-year hunt described in the sources.
It really does. He was caught around 3:40 in the morning by a rookie police officer, Jeffrey Scott Postel.
The rookie?
Yeah. Officer Postel was just on routine patrol, saw someone digging in a trash bin behind a Save-A-Lot grocery store. Initially thought it might just be a break-in attempt or something.
After 5 years hiding in caves and mountains, caught behind a Save-A-Lot.
Scavenging. That was it. He was unarmed when Postel approached him. Didn't resist arrest at all. He gave a fake name at first, Jerry Wilson, claimed he was homeless, from Ohio.
But they figured out who he was pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. Once they got him to the Cherokee County Jail, his resemblance to the wanted posters was undeniable. Everyone knew who they had.
And what did he physically look like then, after 5 years, mostly off-grid?
Well, according to the sources, surprisingly kempt in some ways, clean-shaven, trimmed mustache, dyed black hair. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, work clothes, and relatively new sneakers, still making an effort to blend in, apparently.
And his demeanor. The sources describe him as compliant, subdued, even relieved.
That's a striking detail, isn't it? Such a contrast to his later defiance. One FBI official who was there during the transport mentioned seeing tears in Rudolph's eyes, interpreted it maybe as sadness about leaving the mountains, the place that had hidden him for so long. It really seemed like a moment of just giving up.
So capture, then the legal process kicks in.
Right. Fast forward to April 2005. He's facing multiple federal charges. The death penalty is definitely on the table. He agrees to a plea bargain, pleads guilty to all the charges from all 4 bombings.
And a key part of that deal involved those hidden explosives.
Absolutely critical. It was a non-negotiable condition from the government side. Rudolph had to reveal the locations of all the remaining dynamite he'd stashed in the woods. We're talking about 250 pounds of it.
Wow.
And the FBI was able to go in, find it based on his directions, and safely dispose of it all. That was a direct result of the plea agreement.
So a very real public safety benefit came out of that deal.
Definitely. So he got his sentences later that summer, 2005. 2 consecutive life terms for the Birmingham bombing murder. 3 consecutive life sentences for the Atlanta bombings. No possibility of parole.
And he's currently in ADX Florence Supermax.
That's right. The federal Supermax prison in Colorado. Sources mention the conditions 23 hours a day alone in an 80-square-foot cell.
Now, despite pleading guilty to avoid execution, the sources are unanimous. He showed absolutely no remorse.
None whatsoever. Completely unrepentant. He explicitly stated his motives were about his anti-abortion, anti-gay beliefs. He even framed the plea deal itself not as admission of guilt, but as a tactical choice.
Tactical.
Yeah, his reasoning was basically to deny the government the satisfaction of putting him to death. It was about control, even then.
And he maintained that defiance in the courtroom.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
During the sentencing hearings, he reportedly lectured the judge, quoted scripture about having fought the good fight. He even seemed to gloat, mentioning how close pursuing agents had unknowingly passed by his hiding spots during the manhunt.
And he's continued trying to fight it legally since then. I saw a mention of a failed appeal in 2024.
Yes, but those efforts haven't gone anywhere, largely because he waived his right to appeal as part of that original plea agreement back in 2005.
Of course, we have to remember the immense human cost here. The victims, the families. The impact is profound and lasting.
Absolutely tragic. The sources rightly emphasize the fatalities, the terrible injuries like those Emily Lyons endured, which changed her life forever. You had 14 victims or family members give statements during his sentencing, just heart-wrenching accounts of the pain and loss his actions caused.
And his apology, such as it was.
Very limited. He apparently offered some kind of apology only for the Centennial Park bombing, but even that was framed more as being about his anger at the government, not genuine remorse for the people hurt or killed.
And his legacy. It persists. The sources suggest he's still seen as a hero figure in some extremist circles.
Sadly, yes. Despite everything, the conviction, life imprisonment, he's still viewed by some radical right, Christian identity adherents as an Aryan hero. The sources point to ongoing extremist chatter online that praises him, tries to justify his violence.
Which just highlights that dangerous link between these kinds of warped ideologies and real-world violence.
It really does. It shows how, for some people, the ideology endures long after the person is caught. Even though Rudolph himself apparently later tried to distance himself somewhat from the full Christian identity label, his writings, his justifications for the bombings, they align very closely with those kinds of beliefs. It demonstrates how deep these ideological roots can run and how hard they are to counter.
So let's try to bring this deep dive together. We've seen how Eric Rudolph managed 5 years on the run through this really extraordinary, almost strategic mix of preparedness, deep wilderness knowledge, and surprisingly methodical urban scavenging.
Right, and how the Manhunt, this massive multi-agency effort, was relentless. It evolved over time, faced huge challenges, terrain, media, local attitudes,
Yeah.
but ultimately it did prevent him from staging more attacks and led to his capture, even if the capture itself was somewhat mundane.
Behind a grocery store, yeah. And the legal end involved him giving up those hidden explosives, a key outcome. But his absolute lack of remorse and his rigid ideological stance are a huge part of his legacy. A legacy that, disturbingly, still holds appeal for some extremists.
And looking bigger picture, the whole case served as a major catalyst, driving significant improvements in how federal and local agencies coordinate for domestic counterterrorism,
Yeah.
especially in the post-9/11 era. That need for collaboration was a huge lesson learned here.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider. What does Eric Rudolph's story, his ability to hide for so long, using both the wilderness and the edges of towns, combined with his complete lack of repentance even after capture, what does it reveal about the persistence of certain domestic extremist threats? And maybe the inherent difficulty of confronting not just the individuals involved, but the underlying ideologies that drive them. Something to reflect on after this deep dive.